I took his photograph on a Tuesday afternoon for no better reason than that his face held still in a particular way most faces don't, and it did not occur to me until considerably later, watching a bounty hunter study that same photograph on a wanted circular 3 weeks after, that the stillness I'd found worth capturing was the exact same stillness that would nearly get him killed. I had been working the traveling photography trade for going on 4 years by then, hauling my wagon studio from one dying cattle town to the next across West Texas, setting up my camera and chemical tent wherever a town looked prosperous enough to afford portraits and desperate enough for novelty to want them. It was not a trade many women took up alone, and I had chosen it for reasons that had less to do with any particular love of chemistry or optics than with a promise I'd made myself the year my brother Caleb was hanged by a vigilance committee in a town 2 counties over from where we'd grown up, convicted of a robbery he hadn't committed on the strength of nothing more than a witness's frightened certainty that he resembled the man they were looking for. I still remembered standing beside my father at the edge of that crowd, too young at 15 to understand why nobody seemed interested in the fact that Caleb had been mending fence on our own property the whole of that afternoon. 3 witnesses of our own willing to swear to it. Testimony the committee had waved off as family loyalty rather than fact, simply because it was inconvenient to the certainty they'd already settled on. Nobody had asked for proof beyond that resemblance. Nobody had waited for the actual evidence that surfaced 3 months later, clearing Caleb's name for a family who no longer had a brother left to hear it. I had decided, watching that particular grief settle permanently into my father's face, that I would spend whatever life I had left learning to capture the kind of proof that couldn't be argued away by a frightened man's memory, and a camera, it turned out, was as close to that particular power as a woman in my circumstances was likely to get. Wyatt Calloway rode into Amargo Springs on a Tuesday morning with the particular dust of a man who'd been 3 weeks on the trail alone, and he came to my wagon studio that same afternoon, not for vanity's sake, but because his mother, back in a town he didn't name, had written asking for a likeness she could keep, and he'd apparently decided that a drifter who kept putting off sending one home eventually stopped having a home worth sending it to. He was dark-haired and sun-weathered, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned, somewhere along whatever road had brought him to my studio door, that stillness cost less than movement in situations where movement might be misread. I positioned him in the camera stand's iron head clamp, the particular contraption every sitter dreaded and every photographer required to hold a subject motionless through a long exposure, and explained, as I always did, that the wet collodion plate needed to be coated, sensitized, exposed, and developed inside roughly 15 minutes before the chemicals dried past usefulness, which meant the whole strange ceremony of portraiture happened in a single, continuous rush behind my chemical tent's canvas walls, while the sitter himself simply held still and trusted a stranger with the result. I asked him to hold that stillness for the 8 full seconds my plate required, and he held it so completely, eyes steady on some fixed point past my shoulder, that the resulting portrait came out sharper and more striking than most of the restless cattlemen and nervous brides I usually photographed. And I told him so, plainly, while I worked the plate in my darkroom tent, the sharp bite of ether and collodion thick in that small enclosed space. The developer's particular chemical hushed the only sound besides my own breathing, as his likeness rose slow and pale out of the exposed silver. He told me a little of himself while I developed it. The particular ease some strangers find in talking to a person they expect never to see again. He had drifted through 6 territories over 6 years, taking work where he found it and moving on before it found reasons to keep him, and he admitted with a candor that surprised me that he'd spent a portion of his younger years running with rougher company than he was proud of now. Nothing so serious as the law's worst concerns, he said, but enough minor trouble in enough small towns that lawmen in 3 states still knew his name on sight and formed their opinions of him before he'd said a single word in his own defense. I asked him, curious despite myself, what exactly rougher company had entailed, and he considered the question a long moment before answering, the particular caution of a man deciding how much honesty a new acquaintance had actually earned. Cattle we didn't own mostly moved across lines we had no right crossing, he said. Never drew on a man who wasn't already drawing on me first, and never took anything off anybody who couldn't afford the loss better than we could afford going hungry. Doesn't make it right, just makes it the particular flavor of wrong I've spent considerable effort since trying to outgrow. Man builds himself a reputation before he's got sense enough to know reputations follow you, considerably longer than the mistakes that earned them, he said. I've spent the last 4 years trying to outlive mine. Some days I believe I'm managing it. I displayed a print of his portrait in my studio window that same week, as I did with most of my strongest work, both for the honest pride a photographer takes in a good likeness, and for the practical business reason that passers-by judged my skill by whatever samples they could see without paying first. It hung there 3 days before a traveling dry goods salesman named Purvis came through Amargo Springs on his regular circuit and stopped dead in front of my window. Studying that portrait with an intensity that should have warned me something was wrong before he ever said a word. He came inside without knocking, which was unlike the ordinary run of my customers, and asked before any greeting who exactly had sat for that particular photograph and how recently. I told him it had been taken that same week and watched his face go through several calculations at once, none of them comfortable to witness. He told me, when I asked what had caught his attention, that he'd been in the town of Wayland, 2 counties east the week prior, present at the aftermath of a bank robbery in which the fleeing robber had been glimpsed clearly enough by 3 witnesses to generate a working description, and that the face in my window matched that description closer than any sketch the county sheriff's office had managed to produce. I don't say this lightly, ma'am, he told me,
had already in his hands as though bracing for my objection.
But I've got a memory for faces on account of my trade, and I'd stake considerable money that's the same man, or near enough that a sheriff ought to hear about it regardless. I want to tell you plainly that I did not believe him at first, because believing him meant confronting the exact machinery of injustice that had taken my brother, operating now through my own careful work rather than some stranger's frightened memory, and some part of me needed, for at least that first hour, to hold on to the possibility that Purvis was simply mistaken. He was not mistaken about his own conviction, at least. He rode out that same afternoon toward Wayland, and I learned 3 days later, from the marshal's own mouth, that Purvis had brought word to the county sheriff, who had in turn had my photograph copied and reprinted directly onto an updated wanted circular. The first time in that sheriff's memory, he said, that an actual photograph rather than a hand-drawn likeness had gone out on such a notice, which meant the resemblance Purvis had reported was now circulating the territory, with a permanence no witness's uncertain memory could have carried on its own. Daniel Calloway had been Marshal of Amargo Springs only 4 months by the time that circular reached him, a position the town council had given him more for his willingness to take a dangerous, poorly paid job nobody else wanted than for any particular experience recommending him to it. And I watched him receive that circular with the particular stiffness of a young man suddenly aware that the easiest path forward and the correct one might not be the same path at all. He was sandy-haired and careful-spoken, the kind of lawman who kept meticulous notes in a small book he carried everywhere. And he told me plainly, standing in my studio doorway with the circular still in his hand, that the county sheriff expected him to detain Wyatt on sight, and that a $200 reward attached to that circular meant Wyatt's continued freedom in Amargo Springs was likely to last only as long as it took word to travel to whoever collected bounties for a living in that part of the territory. His own father, he told me later that same week, had worn a badge for 18 years in a town further east, respected enough that 3 separate counties had once tried to poach him for their own sheriff's office, and Daniel had grown up hearing his father repeat, at nearly every supper table conversation that touched on the work at all, that the single fastest way to ruin a man's life permanently was to be the lawman who acted first and verified second, because a badge carried enough weight in most people's eyes that a lawman's mistake rarely got corrected before it had already done its damage. I confronted Daniel with everything I knew about Wyatt's actual movements the week of the Wayland robbery, which was, I realized even as I said it, considerably less than I needed it to be. A vague sense of when he'd first ridden into town. No precise record of dates I could point to with the kind of certainty a court would require. Daniel listened with genuine attention, not the dismissive courtesy of a man already decided, and told me something that surprised me, given how briefly I'd known him, that he had grown up in a household where his own father, a former lawman himself, had drilled into him the particular danger of a badge worn by a man too eager to look decisive rather than be correct. "Man in this job learns fast that being wrong quickly is worse than being right slowly," Daniel said, "though the county sheriff seems considerably more interested in quickly than I'd prefer this week." He agreed, against what I suspected were his own better professional interests, to hold off any formal action for 3 days while I tried to establish where Wyatt had actually been. It was the same evening Daniel gave us that grace period that a stranger rode into Amargo Springs asking pointed questions. At the saloon about a drifter matching Wyatt's description, a lean, unhurried man named Garrity who made no secret, once Daniel confronted him directly, of his profession, a bounty hunter who worked the circulars for a living and had no particular interest in whether the men he collected were guilty so much as whether the reward posted on them was collectible. He wore his indifference the way some men wear a good coat, comfortably and without any apparent awareness of how it looked on him from the outside. And he told Daniel, in a voice pitched loud enough to carry across the saloon floor, that he'd collected on 11 circulars in the past 3 years and had yet to lose a single dollar of reward money to a court's later reconsideration. A record he seemed to regard as proof of his own judgment rather than simple luck. Garrity told Daniel, with a plainness that chilled me considerably more than open hostility would have, that he intended to take Wyatt in himself within the week, regardless of what the local marshal's investigation concluded, because a circular with a photograph on it was, in his considerable experience, close enough to certainty for any judge in the territory to accept. And he did not intend to lose $200 waiting on a small-town marshal's scruples. "Judges don't ask a bounty man to prove innocence or guilt," he said. "They ask him to prove delivery. I've never once failed to deliver." I sat with Wyatt that same night in the back of my studio wagon, both of us too unsettled to sleep, and it was there, in the particular close quiet of two frightened people waiting out a danger neither could fully control, that he told me the rest of what his earlier candor had only hinted at, that the reputation following him wasn't entirely undeserved, that he'd ridden with a rough outfit in his early 20s who'd done considerably worse than the minor trouble he'd first admitted to, and that he had left that company only after watching a friend from those days get exactly the kind of rough frontier justice Garrity now represented, strung up on evidence considerably thinner than what a court would have required, while Wyatt himself had ridden away that same night, rather than risk being caught in the same net. He described that friend, a boy he'd known since childhood named Silas, with a specific tenderness that told me the grief hadn't dulled much with the years between, and admitted that some part of the reason he'd never settled anywhere long enough to build a proper reputation was the particular fear that settling meant eventually standing still long enough for his own past to catch up the same way it had caught Silas. "I've spent 6 years since telling myself I outran what I used to be," he said. "Watching that circular go up with my own face on it, I'm not entirely certain a man ever really outruns anything. Mostly he just changes towns fast enough that the running looks like progress." I told him about Caleb then, the whole of it, the first time I had told anyone that particular story since leaving my father's house, and something in the telling, his careful listening, the particular way he didn't flinch from the ugliest parts of it, settled a fear in me I hadn't fully named even to myself, that the tenderness building between us over these past days might simply be the kind of feeling danger manufactures in people thrown too close together too fast. He took my hand at some point during that long telling, careful and slow enough that I could have pulled away easily if I'd wanted to, and I found I did not want to. Not even slightly, though neither of us said anything more definite about it that night than the simple fact of our hands staying joined until the lamp finally burned itself down to nothing. Daniel began his own quiet investigation the following morning, riding to Wayland himself despite the county sheriff's clear preference for a simpler resolution. A 2-day round trip he made on his own time and his own horse, rather than requisition the town's single spare mount for what his supervisors clearly regarded as an unnecessary errand. He told me afterward that the Wayland sheriff's deputy had seemed almost put out by the questions, having already considered the matter settled the moment the photograph went out, and that it had taken Daniel the better part of an afternoon simply to convince the man to let him speak with the three original witnesses, separately rather than accept the deputy's own summary of what they'd supposedly agreed upon together. He returned 2 days later with information that considerably complicated the tidy story Purvis's identification had suggested. The three witnesses who described the Wayland robber, questioned separately and carefully rather than together as the original sheriff's deputy had questioned them, gave descriptions that agreed on general build and coloring, but disagreed on several particulars. Wyatt's actual features didn't match, a scar the real robber reportedly carried along his jaw that Wyatt had never had. A distinctive gray mare the robber had ridden that bore no resemblance to Wyatt's own bay gelding, which several people in Imago Springs could vouch. He'd been riding the entire 3 weeks he'd been drifting through the territory. Well before the robbery occurred, I did my own part of that investigation from the ledger I kept from my photography business, a habit born less of any expectation it would ever matter to a court, and more of simple professional discipline. Every session I photographed, I recorded the date, the sitter's name, and the time of day, both to track my chemical usage and to settle the occasional dispute over which prints belonged to which customer. I had photographed 3 other sitters that same Tuesday besides Wyatt. A rancher's wife wanting a likeness for her husband away on a cattle drive. 2 young sisters whose mother wanted a memorial portrait made while they were both still healthy, and a retired schoolteacher who'd sat for his own portrait twice already that year, simply for the company of conversation while I worked. And each of those sittings recorded plainly in my ledger with the hour marked beside the sitter's name. Boxed Wyatt's own appointment tightly enough on either side that no reasonable accounting could have placed him 40 miles distant, robbing a bank in the gaps between. That ledger showed plainly that I had photographed Wyatt on the Tuesday in question. The same afternoon, the Wayland robbery had occurred some 40 miles distant. An alibi that could not have placed him at both locations at once, regardless of what any witness's frightened memory claimed to have seen. I brought that ledger to Daniel myself, along with 3 other Imago Springs residents willing to swear to Wyatt's presence in town that same week, and watched something in his young face settle into the particular satisfaction of a man who has found, at real professional risk to himself, the correct answer rather than merely the convenient one. Garrity did not accept the ledger's evidence easily. He confronted Daniel outside the marshal's office 2 days later, loud enough that half of Imago Springs' main street turned to watch, insisting that a photographer's business record proved considerably less than a photograph on an official circular, and that he intended to take Wyatt regardless of what a small-town marshal's amateur investigation concluded. A crowd had gathered by then, drawn by Garrity's raised voice, and I watched the particular calculation cross several familiar faces in that crowd, neighbors and customers I'd photographed myself over the preceding weeks, weighing whether to stay silent or to speak up on behalf of a man half the town had only known a short while. It was the rancher's wife I'd photographed that same Tuesday who spoke first, stepping forward to confirm plainly that she'd sat in my chair not 30 minutes before Wyatt had, and her husband beside her adding that he'd seen Wyatt himself walking toward my studio that same afternoon on his way back from the feed store. And once that first voice broke the crowd's silence, 3 more followed in quick succession, each with some small corroborating detail of their own. It was Daniel who stood his ground in a way I hadn't fully expected from a man only 4 months into the job, informing Garrity plainly, in front of the gathering crowd, that any attempt to remove a man from his jurisdiction without proper legal process would be treated as exactly the crime it was, badge or no reward attached, and that he had already wired the county sheriff with the corrected witness statements and my business ledger both, requesting the circular be formally withdrawn. I understand a reward's a powerful thing to walk away from, Daniel told him. But I've learned this week that a badge is only worth wearing if a man's willing to be unpopular in the service of being right. I'd rather lose this job over that principle than keep it by handing you an innocent man. The county sheriff's formal reply reached Imago Springs 3 days later, withdrawing the circular entirely and noting, with the particular brevity of official correspondence correcting its own mistake, that the Wayland investigation would proceed with corrected witness testimony and a description that no longer matched Wyatt Calloway in any particular the court considered reliable. Daniel read that letter aloud to me and Wyatt both in the marshal's office, and I watched something visibly leave Wyatt's shoulders as the words landed. A tension I hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying every waking hour since Purvis first stopped in front of my window. Garrity left town within the hour of that reply reaching Daniel's office. Philosophical in the particular way of a man for whom this had simply been one lost bounty among many others still worth chasing. Stopping only long enough to tell Daniel without any apparent rancor that he respected a lawman who did the paperwork properly, even when it cost him a tidy arrest. A compliment delivered with such professional detachment that it took me a moment to recognize it as one at all. I watched him ride out with a relief so complete it left my knees genuinely unsteady beneath me, and Wyatt caught my elbow, steadying me with a hand that lingered there considerably longer than balance alone required. Wyatt stayed on in Amargo Springs considerably longer than the 3 weeks he'd originally intended. First, because Daniel asked him, with a directness that surprised us both, to consider standing as his part-time deputy, given how thoroughly the town had watched him conduct himself under pressure that would have broken plenty of men with cleaner reputations. And then, once he'd accepted that position, simply because leaving no longer suited a man who had finally found a town willing to know the whole of his history and choose him anyway. He wrote his mother that same week, the letter he'd apparently been putting off composing since well before he ever rode into Amargo Springs, and included with it the second photograph, rather than the first, telling me he wanted her to have the likeness of the man he'd actually become, rather than the guarded stranger who'd first sat in my chair. He took to the deputy work with a seriousness that surprised even Daniel, memorizing the town's ordinances within a month and handling 2 minor disputes over cattle strays, with a patience that several older residents remarked favorably reminded them of lawmen from a gentler, more careful era than the one Garrity represented. I photographed him a second time that autumn, this time with no urgent purpose beyond the simple fact that I wanted a portrait of my own to keep. And he held that same particular stillness through the full exposure, though something in his eyes had eased considerably from the first sitting. The specific wariness of a man who no longer needed his own face to give nothing away. Daniel earned, over that same season, the kind of quiet town respect that no amount of decisive posturing could have purchased faster, and I noticed the county sheriff himself rode through Amargo Springs that winter specifically to shake his hand. An unusual courtesy for a man whose only prior interaction with the marshal had been a wire correcting his own department's mistake. The sheriff stayed the better part of an afternoon, I heard afterward, reviewing with Daniel the particulars of how he'd conducted the Whalen interviews separately rather than together, and left instructing his own deputies to adopt the same practice going forward, which struck most of Amargo Springs as a considerably larger vindication than any formal apology could have offered. Daniel never spoke of that visit with anything resembling pride, only the same careful modesty he brought to most things, though I noticed he began keeping his father's old badge, previously stored away in a drawer, pinned instead beside his own on the wall of the marshal's office, as though he'd finally decided he'd earned the right to hang the two side by side. I think Daniel understood, better than most men his age in that particular line of work, that the badge had never really been about being right quickly. It had simply been, for him, about learning to be right at all. However long the learning took, and however unpopular the waiting made him along the way, I still keep that first photograph of Wyatt in my own collection, separate from the prints I sell, and some evenings, developing a new sitter's plate in the dim red light of my darkroom tent. I think of Caleb, and of Purvis's convinced certainty outside my studio window, and of how close an honest likeness came to being the very thing that hanged an innocent man, rather than the thing that finally, properly, saved one. A photograph never lies about what a face looked like in a single held breath of stillness. It only ever waits for somebody patient enough to ask it the right question before deciding what that stillness meant.